I've come to realize that I will never have a relationship with my son. This happened last year, but yesterday I got a grim reminder. Before we start off with this train wreck of a story, here is some background information. I've been a car mechanic since the age of 19. And I've had my own garage and store since I was 28 years old. After my first marriage went to shambles, I remarried a few years later. Just like my current wife, she had a son from her first marriage. My stepson was around 4 years old back then, and he sees me as his real father. Seeing his own father walked out on him. My son from my first marriage was living with his mom, but I saw him quite often since my shop was on his way back from school. He would drop by occasionally to say hello or look at the cars I had in the shop. My wife and ex-wife actually got along well. There were never any issues with my son staying over or staying for dinner, though he lived with his mom. When I turned 17, my dad bought me a black Chevrolet Chevelle SS. Throughout my entire life, I've always taken care of that car. I love that car to death, and 90% of it is still consisting of its original parts. Being a mechanic, I had no issues doing everything myself. This car was often in front of my shop or in my garage at home. My son loved this car as well. He always wanted to go along for rides. And he knew everything about it. He even had a small model car that looked just like it. So, where did it go wrong, you wonder? My ex-wife remarried as well 8 years ago, but they moved a few states away after her new husband got a new job offer. After that, I mostly spoke to my son on the telephone and saw him maybe once every 3 to 4 months for a long weekend or half a week. Eventually, the phone calls became less frequent, and he said he wanted to focus on his schoolwork, which was understandable as he was a teen. I couldn't blame him for that. My stepson was already 10 at that time. When my son was 16, he went to university a few states away, and I barely had time to speak to him or see him. My business was doing bad at the time, and my wife had also gotten really sick with E. coli and kidney failure. It was tough keeping everything together, but somehow we made it through all of it, and my wife is doing far better now. Fast forward to April 2019, my stepson was turning 16 that month. He always got along with my son, so he invited him. My son was busy at the time but promised he would show up a few days later. After all that happened, I hadn't seen him for almost 4 years, so I was glad he was coming over. Now here comes the part where I messed up badly. My stepson was a grade A student. Even when times were tough. He managed to get good grades at school and even got into the university where he wanted to study medicine. My wife and I were so proud of him, so I decided to give him my old Chevrolet Chevelle for his 16th birthday. He was pretty amazed by it, and so were his friends. It's a car that, to this day, still makes an impact. Unfortunately, it had an unexpected impact on my relationship with my son. I texted him a picture of my stepson with the car on his 16th birthday party, not knowing what would happen next. My son texted me back with "Is this a joke?" I didn't understand at the time and texted him back with "No, why?" He called me a few seconds later, yelling at me to tell him that it was a joke. He told me that I promised him the car when he was 10 years old, that if he did well in school, I would give it to him. The part that made me yell back at him through the phone was when he called me a lousy father that didn't care about his real son. Let me tell you, things were said from both sides that weren't nice from that point onwards. My wife told me to calm down and talk it out because there was some misunderstanding. I then did the most regrettable thing I've done, and if I could take it back, I would do it. I told my son in a fit of rage that he didn't deserve the car and that he could call me back if he changed his attitude. After I hung up the phone, I got into a fight with my wife, who stood up for my son. At that moment, I didn't care. I was insulted for being called a bad father. I tried to contact my son a few days afterwards, but I wouldn't get any response. I think he changed his phone number a day after the fight. Couldn't care any less at the time. 3 weeks later, my ex-wife called, furious as hell. My son had apparently graduated from university. And I now know in hindsight that I was not invited by my son. My ex-wife already found it strange that I wasn't there and talked to my son. He told her there and then everything that happened and that he was planning to invite me to the graduation on the day he was supposed to visit. The worst thing is, he was graduating as an automotive service technician and was apparently one of the best in his class. I then realized that I was indeed a bad father. In those 4 years of not seeing him and all the stress around me, I didn't even bother to ask what he was studying. My ex-wife told me that he was heartbroken and felt like he was unwanted, unlike my stepson. She started crying on the phone, saying he just wanted to be a mechanic just like me. He apparently wanted to move back and work with me in my shop and take over when I was going to retire. My entire world crumbled up in front of me, and I felt and still feel so incredibly stupid for saying those things to him. My ex-wife wouldn't give me his new number and address, seeing he wanted no contact with me ever again. She also told me to never reach out to her ever again. It's been more than a year now, and I've had a few fights about it with my wife. My stepson gave the car back and settled for something else if it meant that my son would come back. I've tried getting into contact with him for the last 11 months. Until a few months ago. The last thing I found out was that he was working for some big car manufacturer. Unfortunately, they refused to give out any information about the people working there. Yesterday, I got a package from him, unexpectedly. It didn't come with a letter or return address on it. But I knew it was from him. It was a box with his old Chevrolet toy car, an old picture ripped up of him and me on the hood of the car, and a videotape. I watched the videotape, and he was probably 7 years old at the time. In the video, I was fixing a car. I cried halfway through this because I then knew why he mailed me the tape. I said to him while he was filming it, "If you want and keep up your grades, the shop could be yours one day, including my Chevy."